kind of faded away. And then Second Life, and I always joke about my Learning in 3D book that you can pretty much track the decline of Second Life to the day that that book came out. So I think mobile took a lot of the air out of the room, which kind of surprised me. But it's great to see this coming back. Unfortunately, it's because of a pandemic, but there's some really good things I think that are happening. I'm excited about that. I always joke about my Learning in 3D book. So let's go ahead and talk about what we want to define as Second Life to the day. I want to talk literally about designing a 3D world. I think mobile took a lot of the elements to think about what are some sensibilities of 3D that we should leverage. We talk about activities that make 3D kind of come alive and design in 3D. And yeah, it has been. You know, if you look, it's very interesting. The Gartner hype cycle, you can see, you know, Second Life had the point of inflated expectations, and then it was a little bit in the trough of disillusionment, and now it's on the slope of enlightenment, which basically means people that have been doing it really now know what works well in 3D and all that kind of stuff. So really, really kind of a fascinating technology sociology study. So I remember my first time in a virtual world. I came into a virtual classroom and it was teaching English as a second language. And I sat in a virtual chair and looked at virtual PowerPoint, and I thought, boy, wouldn't it be great if I could have been in a hotel room or in a bistro or something like that. So Tony Ojusko and I sat down and we determined that in order to make 3D as effective as it possibly could, let's create a model that makes sense. So we created the 3D-LE architecture, 3D learning and education model, and we thought about what would make it most effective. So we're not going to talk about the whole model today. We're really just going to talk about the principles of the model. If you're really interested, you can check out the macro structures and the archetypes and stuff like that. But I just wanted to focus on this because I think it's really helpful from an instructional design perspective. So let's go ahead and talk about those principles. So here we've got principles of designing instruction, and we kind of look at it two ways. One is around the entire design process, we have reflectively synthesized, and we'll talk about what that means and why we think that's important. But in the center, we have instructionally grounded. But swirling all around, and the reason why we have the arrows in the movement is because these things we think should be constantly be going on in order to make that as sound a learning experience as possible. You don't need all these elements all the time, but they're really kind of important for the overall gestalt. So let's go ahead and look at these individually. So let's first look at instructionally grounded. So what do we mean by instructionally grounded? Well, basically, is it a vetted learning need? Are the learners receiving the content that they need in that environment? You all probably have seen 3D environments that maybe don't need to be 3D. So a lot of effort and a lot of time goes into that. So how do we make 3D more attractive from that perspective? So instructionally grounded 3D is, I think, really effective if we want to get into the affective domain, right? We want to get into emotion. You want to see how people react under stress or uncertain situations, or even acting in an area where there might be some fear or some movement. So I think that's really helpful to think about when we want to consider learning in 3D. We want to consider the affective domain. We also want to consider things like group coordination, where we want people to work together, interacting in real time, accomplishing things under pressure. Group and individual performance makes sense as well. And then finally, rehearsal. Rehearsing items in the 3D world is a great way to provide. I always think of 3D as kind of a bridge between the typical didactic kind of instruction and then actual hands-on doing the instruction. And also, finally, we need a high degree of realism, right? We want to have a realistic environment for people to be able to work in. All of those are good instructionally grounded techniques for 3D. But also, we need to think about people-to-people interactions. And really kind of an interesting thing when we were looking at 3D is that a number of organizations, first responder organizations, do rehearsals across organizations in 3D environments because they want people to practice making bad decisions. Because in a 3D world, it's a safe environment to make a bad decision. You can recover from that. You don't really die. You actually can bounce right back. But sometimes in an actual physical simulation, that might not be as possible. And the other thing that's interesting is if you create these pressure-filled environments, realistic but pressure-filled, people react differently. People get mad. People become immersed in that environment, and they behave as they would. A lot of times, if we're sitting in a classroom or something, we know how to behave. We know to raise our hand if we have a question. We know we're not supposed to talk while other people are talking, that kind of stuff. But I've seen situations where people have gotten caught up in a 3D virtual environment and they start reacting as they would in the actual environment. And that's really ultimately where you want to get. You want to get people reacting at that level, reacting viscerally so that they can learn and train for that environment. You know, people do silly things. Pressure sometimes can dull our senses. We miss things. So all of these elements can help us with our instructionally grounded message. And I always think if I'm thinking of students and I want to put them in a situation, but I want to put them in that situation safely, that's a good way to do that. That's something that can be very, very helpful. So next, we want to look at the environment being reflectively synthesized. So I always say there's no learning without reflection. It's only an experience. So if we really want people to learn from our 3D experience as we're putting together a 3D situation or model or something that's happening, if you're in a cafe trying to order food, or if you're trying to decipher a code, or if you're trying to coordinate emergency responses, we want to have those experiences, but we also want to have a chance to reflect. Because reflection really helps with learning. And we know from the research that one of the really good ways to create experiences is to have people prepare for the experience, tell them what's going to be happening, what's the what they should anticipate, and then provide that experience. Let them actually experience what's happening in that 3D virtual environment, and then give a chance for reflection and application. In the military, they call it after action review. But what the reflection does is allow the learners to tie the experience to both FAR transfer, what they're going to do in the future, and also schemas that they already know. So when you're going to do VR, and someone said, you know, reflection should not be any different. It should not be different. It should be the same thing. You know, the interesting thing to me is with all these new technologies, we always sometimes have these, oh, we have to teach mobile this way. Oh, we have to do VR this way. Oh, we have to do AR this way. But if you go back and dig to the sound instructional design models, theories, and concepts, those are all the same. They're all familiar. So I think that's really kind of important. So here's an example of, but sometimes it's a little difficult. So here's an example I want to show you of something that we've done. We were doing some training for, in this case, it was pre-call planning for sales folks. And we weren't going to be there. They were going to have a 3D experience, but it was not instructor-led. So how do you get them to have the experience, to think about the experience? You know, if you remember the model, we've got to prep them for that, then we've got to do it. So what we did in the environment is we gave the learners elements of the sales model and told them to reflect or think about what they would do after we gave them a scenario. Like, what would you do in this situation? So the idea was kind of to get them thinking about how they're going to act and react in that 3D environment without us being there as instructors. And then the next thing, we let them go into that 3D environment and experience the world and give them feedback. So the world in that particular case was to go through to different people within the physician's office, talk to those people, interact with those people, and then try to actually sell them a product. And then when they were done, we wanted a way to debrief it in kind of fun, interesting way. And so what we did was we actually set up interview questions. So rather than say, okay, now that you've learned this, we want you to reflect upon da-da-da, but we said, hey, you were in this environment and a lot of crazy things happened. Can you answer some interview questions? And so what we did was give them the opportunity to allow people to actually interview and answer questions and do that from a reflective perspective. So even if an instructor is not available to debrief the 3D learning environment, it's still possible to design the environment to start kind of with an advanced organizer, thinking about what's happening, giving them that experience, and then having them debrief in kind of a fun way through an interview. So I think one of the things that we can do in 3D virtual realities is really kind of make them fun and interesting and kind of add some fun, realistic elements to them. So now let's get into the elements that are swirling around in this 3D model. And the first is participant-centered. And what we really want to do this, and again, good classrooms follow this practice already, but we really want the instruction to be built around the learner instead of the learner adapting to the instruction. So when you think about it in actually situations like this or many classrooms, we use a broadcast model. We broadcast our message out to all the learners and they get the same message, and we aren't always able to tailor it exactly to what the learner needs. But in 3D environment, we can do group discussions and groups environments. Yeah, Bill, you're right on, right? But different kinds of instruction require different kinds of elements and environments. And in some ways, we are limited by the technology. In some ways, we're freed by the technology. So I think acknowledging what we're able to do and not able to do is really important. And as 3D technologies have gotten easier and easier and simpler to use, we'll soon be able to very quickly program some of these things that we want to do. But here's an environment where we're matching visual symbols in the slide here, visual symbols to actually text-based symbols. And individuals can go in there individually and at your own pace and at your own rhythm, you can go through that exercise. You can go through it multiple times. You can go through it one time. You can go through it with friends. You can collaborate. So the idea is that rather than you being given the information, you are able to actually see this information in kind of a different kind of a clip. So that's one thing to think about. Another thing to think about is to make it discovery driven. So when we set up environments, exploration is really an important element. If you look at Bartle's player types, my slides seem to be having a mind of their own. But if you set up Bartle's players types, exploration is a big one that you want to do and that kind of helps you. And exploration is a really good thing to work into if you can 3D environments, allowing people to have those experiences of exploring an environment, checking it out, and using constructivism to build their own knowledge as they go through those environments, which I think is kind of an interesting affordance of 3D that's not available always in other types of environments. So then we have contextually situated. So I think that's really important in that we can create the context. And this is a 3D world here, LearnBright, but lots of 3D worlds allow you to do this. I can pick from literally dozens of contexts to immerse the learner into. So if we're going to try to teach maybe clinical to people in nurses training, if we're going to try to teach somebody how to be a salesperson out on the street, something as simple as working in an office, we used to take our students back when you could interact physically to field trips. And I have graduate students And we took graduate students to field trips of companies so that they could see how it worked in the environment. And the really interesting thing was that the students afterwards said, well, boy, it was really amazing to me, Dr. Kapp, how I could see, the cubicles and the conference rooms and the office and how people dressed. And so it kind of struck me very interestingly that, if you think about it, if you're in college and even if you're in K through 12, or you might never have been in a corporate setting before. And boy, there's a lot of value of being immersed in that setting just to see what it's like. So 3D environments, even something as simple as showing students kind of this is a representative office, or here's kind of offices are set up, it just mentally prepares them for what they may be doing or working in and that kind of environment. Here's some things to think about with those 3D spaces, right? Always design a space with a clear goal in mind so you know what you're going to use the space for. Align it with the affordances that we talked about here as well. Design it for the avatars. This is interesting. We found that you need about 30% larger space than you do regular. A lot of people want it to be, very proportional to what it would look like in the physical space. But what happens there is avatars don't maneuver as well as we do physically. Avatars, if they get too close to a wall, sometimes can see through the wall. And it just gives a weird experience. It breaks the immersion. So if you can make it a little bit bigger, that can be helpful. And then the final is familiarity versus usability. And I think this is interesting because we want to create familiar spaces, but we want them to be usable. And so if we create like a fantasy world, because, hey, we can do anything that we want, the learner may not know how to work in that fantasy world, know what needs to be done in that fantasy world. So we always have to, I think, balance the two between familiarity and usability. So the next one, and here's an example of context, right? And if we know from the research that actually the context helps us to recall information. So if we can put somebody who's learning to be a nurse practitioner in a nursing environment, in a clinical, in a hospital environment, we know that the recall and the information that they have will be very helpful as they go through the process. So that can be a really good way to think about designing these 3D worlds. So another one is action-oriented. If we can, we want the learners to do something. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to do something the entire time. It means we need to, I always talk about a curve of interest when I design instruction. So basically, kind of following the curve of interest in TV shows and video games, right? You start off with something really, really exciting and engaging. You watch a TV show and somebody is killed, and you have to kind of deal with that. And then there's this little kind of a slowdown, and then there's something that you think, oh, they caught the person who did it, but they didn't really catch the person. And kind of, so that's all action oriented. So when we design these 3D experiences, we want to design them as action oriented. And here's an example that we did a number of years ago about auditing inventory in a 3D environment. And so basically, you were working as an auditor in Grandma's Gourmet Cookies, and you actually had to go into the factory and actually perform an audit. And you could walk up to non-player characters, ask them questions about the audit, and if you didn't ask them the right question, they got upset with you, they didn't respond, or they gave you wrong information. So you can kind of go like that as you go through this experience, and you were actually getting that experience. And the reason why we did that was because to show difference between, to introduce people to a factory and a factory environment. Okay, so now let's go to consequentially experienced. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that when you do your actions and activities in the 3D virtual environment, that they have specific consequences. Something that you do results in either a positive or a negative outcome. And if you think about learning environment, traditional learning environments, we give the students the instruction, then we quiz or test them. Sometimes in traditional college environments, weeks later we test them. But in a 3D environment, we can have the instruction, and then right away, you can see whether or not you know it. When you test somebody later on, you're giving them lots of time of, do I know this? Do I not know it? I need to study, I need to restudy. But if you give the information and you apply it in the 3D environment, you can see right away whether or not you've gotten that information, whether or not that information is having the impact that you want. And the consequences give you this visceral reaction. So rather than cognitively going, oh yeah, that's not the right way to do it, you're like, I've killed my character. Now I have to start over. And there's a sense of, oh, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I have to do that. So this gives us even more of kind of that emotional and affective coordination with our projects and with our 3D worlds that makes it much more memorable. And we're able to recall what the mistakes were and avoid those mistakes in the future. So it can be really, really helpful from a lot of different perspectives. And then we have, finally, we want to do it, collaboratively. We want to have it motivated collaboratively. And what does that mean? Well, basically, we want people to be able to work together. This is Second Life Classic, I call it, because this is an old image of Second Life. But you can still, within Second Life and a lot of these virtual tools, you're able to build with others. And you can build both physical things or virtually physical things, but you can also build shared experiences, collaborated experiences working together. So when we think of things like teamwork and we think of things like having later on being able to share an experience, 3D virtual worlds gives us that experience. In fact, there's an article written clear back in 2003, which seems like ages ago, which was in the Harvard Business Review. And it talked about having leadership training being developed in World of Warcraft. So if you think about that, and back then, because think about it, you have to work with people that you may never meet face to face. You have to collaborate on quests. You have to divide up the loot, and there's not enough loot to go around, so you got to figure that out. So they believe that those kind of environments would give us a leadership practice, a leadership simulator. And if you think about what's happening now all over the world, virtual environments are where we're exhibiting leadership, where we're showing leaders and things like that. So it's really kind of interesting. Someone asked for the URL. I actually have the physical copy of the magazine. So I don't know if it's online or not. I would have to look. I have never looked it up because I have the physical copy. That was way back when. But that's funny. I'll have to look and see if it is online. So those are the elements, and you want to think about making it participant-centered, making it contextually situated, like what's the situation where this is going to occur. Make it discovery-driven, action-oriented, consequently experienced, and collaboratively motivated. Those things are all, I think, really important elements as we think about. A lot of times when we first or early get into a technology, we reproduce what we have. Like we've got auditoriums, we've got classrooms. And when movies were first created, they literally set up a projector and filmed plays. So now I think what we need to do is start to move to the next level with elements of this model and create these rich experiences that we know are possible in 3D environments. And some people are already doing them, etc. And now in this presentation, I'm not going to go over these, but each design principle that I talked about, I have some questions to think about. So I guess I'll work with Heather and Jonathan, try to figure out how to get this slide deck to everyone so that you can have this information. I think it's really valuable to have it there. And also, the other thing I want to talk about as I wrap up my presentation is that this is part of a 4-part model. So we have the principles, which are the first part of the model. Then we have the macro structures, which are larger elements, things like exploration, things like avatar agency, which are really important. And then we've got archetypes. So archetypes are things that you tend to do in the 3D world. Maybe you're doing role plays or things like that. And then finally, sensibilities are why used 3D. So I see a question: how do you design for collaboratively motivated experience in 3D environment that one experiences by themselves? So one of the things that you could do in that environment, and we've done it before, is leave artifacts. So you can actually have learners in 3D environments maybe create something and have somebody else come and comment on it or add to it or build to it and then add their own message. And so you can make that an asynchronous environment where people are collaborating but not at the same time. So that's one way that you can handle that type of environment and that type of situation. So I believe I am out of time, but I'd be glad to answer any questions that you have, or I think there's going to be chat on the side somewhere. Is that right?
Yeah, Karl, I asked folks to put their questions in the chat and keep talking to you, so I obligated you to stay in this room, Karl.
Okay, sure, no problem.
Okay. Sure, yeah. So if you have any questions and you'd like to post them to Karl, you're welcome to use the chat pod, and he's going to stay in the room because the chat pod would disappear for you, Karl, if you left the room. So that's why I set that up. So if you'll enjoy yourself looking at the chat pod in a bit.
Great. And yeah, someone asked if this is applicable to VR. Absolutely. The same sensibilities that are in virtual worlds are in virtual reality. Virtual reality is basically world that we're totally immersed into. So it definitely happens, and it's definitely applicable outside of just the flat 3D worlds. Okay, so I should move off the stage though. There's going to be another speaker coming up. I don't want to.
We are, but before you go, let's give some F4 for Karl. Thank you very much for your presentation. Clapping.
Thanks.
Awesome. And I'd like to point out, hopefully you can all hear me. Let me just kind of do a test with the audience. Can you still hear me? This is Heather speaking. Karl, you can slip off now. Yep, you're good. Joseph can move off too. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Awesome. Right now we're going to take a few minutes to switch out speakers. You can stretch your legs for just a moment. If you'd like to stand up and get a fresh drink of water or something, you're welcome to. Oops, I see Frida Lynn is right behind me. So what I'm going to temporarily do, everybody, is I'm going to temporarily change it back to spatial sound, I hope, and then that way the very back of the room won't hear us. But that doesn't mean you don't have sound. It's just going to cut it down to probably just the front row catches us while we set up some slides. So hang with us as we change out here.